Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. It looks like we have 15 folks. We had 28 registered, so we'll wait just another second and let folks get on. We have the whole OWEB regional program rep team in waiting, so we won't wait too long, but we'll give folks another second here to see if they can find their way on. Okay, a bunch of folks just jumped on, so I think we'll get started. I want to welcome you again to the webinar. This is a third Thursday webinar series. I'm Shawn Morford. I'm the Executive Director of the Network of Oregon Watershed Councils, and we're part of the Oregon Conservation Partnership that brings you these third Thursday webinars. Sometimes we have short, sometimes we have long webinars, and so we welcome SWCDs and watershed councils and other partners that find their way to these webinars to join us. In a minute, I'm going to hand this over to Katie Dusick, who is the North Coast Regional Program Rep for OWEB, but I have a couple of housekeeping things I'll go over. Those of you who have been on these webinars a lot know this drill pretty well, but I'll let you know how you can intersect or interact with the presenters and with the PowerPoint as we go along. So let me just say a couple things about that. Everybody is muted by default when you get on, but there are a couple of ways you can be heard. One is to raise your little icon hand when you have a question, and depending on how it's going with the presenter and how our timing is, I will unmute you and invite you to ask your question or make your comment. The other way to ask a question or make a comment is to type your question in the question box. So my job as the moderator is to watch for the little icon hands and to watch for the questions as they come in, and I'll look for the right time to present those questions to the presenter. During the webinar, one of the ways that this technology allows us to make this as interactive as possible is that we have several poll questions. So again, if you've been on these before, you know how they work, but there'll be sort of a multiple choice set of questions, and they're sort of quiz questions in a way this time to help you think through some of the content. Just as a reminder that we are always looking for webinar topics and webinar presenters. So if you have something you want to share, sort of a show and tell, a technique that's really worked well for you, tips and tricks that you might want to share with your colleagues, we always welcome other people to do these webinars, and we will help you set them up. We'll do a little dry run with you, and you can share them. We don't have to do them just on the third Thursday. We can do them at other times as well. So keep that in mind. The technology is available. We really want to keep using it. It's a great way to interact with people without having to travel. So just a reminder, next month's webinar is July 19th, so Thursday, July 19th at 10 o'clock, and we're going to have a communications staff person from the Oregon Lottery join us. And this will be of particular interest to your outreach folks. He's going to be talking, his name is Matt Shelby, and he's going to be talking about core messaging and how to distill complex science-based topics down to simple, clear, and memorable statements. So this is a session that happened at Connect, and it was so popular and had such good feedback from folks that we decided to make it into a webinar. Last item to mention, and logistics-wise, is there's a short survey at the end of this webinar, and we really encourage you, actually hope and ask if you will take a few minutes at the end to fill it out. We need to continue to tell our funders the difference that these programs make, and the more comments that we can share with them about the impact to you and how they are helpful to you, the better for all of us. Okay, so today's webinar, I've been very excited about this. I know several of you have emailed me saying that you're really looking forward to this presentation. It's one of our more complex ones. We have 6 presenters, and so we're going to be playing with logistics a little bit to make sure we get the timing right. This will be a 90-minute webinar, and I had the benefit of seeing this webinar presented at one of the OWEB meetings, and I thought it was so insightful and so well done that we invited this team to present at the Connect conference. And it's such important information for anybody who is seeking OWEB funding that we decided to do it as a webinar. So this will be recorded, and it'll be posted on the network website along with the PowerPoint from today and a couple of handouts. So I'm going to hand it over to Katie to tell us how she's going to run this. And hi, Katie. And we'll get started with this presentation. Go ahead, Katie. Don't hear you, Katie. There.
Thank you. My name is Katie Duzick. I am OWEB's North Coast Program Representative, so I'm coming to you today from Newport, Oregon. Today we're really excited to talk to you about understanding our evaluation criteria and review process. That was the original title of our webinar, but Sean jazzed it up, and it's now called Thinking Like an OWEB Review Team, which is exactly what we're trying to provide you with some insight today. So what we're going to do is each of us from around the state is going to take one of our evaluation criteria and delve into it. And so as Sean mentioned, there are 6 of us. We're all spread out through Oregon. So please bear with us as we transfer around from presenter to presenter, since this is the first time we've attempted a technological feat such as this. So with that, I'll get started with our presentation. So today, some of our goals are to really provide you with some insight into the OWEB review process. So we're going to take you behind the scenes, so to speak. I know lots of times folks feel that they submit an application to us, it goes into some black box and comes out with some result. And what we're really hoping to do is let you know how the review teams are looking at these applications and how they're focusing their discussion. And through this, we're hoping that we'll be able to increase your ability to develop a competitive project and application. And then we're going to talk about the mystery around project ranking, and hopefully it won't be such a mystery anymore, so you can understand how your projects come out ranked in which order and the thought process that the review teams put into that. And we hope that you'll be able to get some tips and tricks along the way for a successful application. So what we're going to talk about is, first, I'm going to talk a little bit about restoration projects, what is eligible and what isn't. Then we're going to take you backstage at the review team meeting. So again, each of us from around the state, your RPRs, are going to discuss a different evaluation criteria: proposal clarity, technical soundness, cost effectiveness, watershed context, capacity of applicants. And then we're going to delve into the prioritization process, and we'll have time for questions at the end. But as Sean mentioned, if you have an urgent question during the presentation, raise your hand and Sean will find a good time to interject so you can get that answered without having to wait all the way to the end. So first, I'd like to talk about restoration project eligibility. So in our rules, it says that the board shall provide grants for watershed projects that protect or restore watershed function. And so our rules go on to define watershed function, which is the processes that support a healthy watershed ecosystem. And watershed health is the condition of a watershed as measured by the ability of the watershed to capture, store, and release water, transport sediment and nutrients to provide clean water, quality fish and wildlife habitat, and adequate stream flows. So one thing that you might notice when you think about this definition of what is eligible is lots of things are eligible. There really is not a great ceiling on the kinds of projects that OWEB can fund, which is pretty neat and innovative, really. But certain types of projects tend to be more competitive than others in our review process, and that's what we're hoping to take you through today. Here's what the rules look like, and throughout this presentation, you're going to see these boring rule slides, and I apologize for that. But our intent is just to show you what the review teams have to look at when they're trying to make decisions. When you submit a project to OWEB, the first thing that happens is OWEB staff do a basic eligibility check. And we can see if the project is adhering to this rule about project eligibility. And I want to note that one of the reasons that prompted this presentation is the rules around eligibility and our evaluation criteria underwent some slight changes about a year ago. One of the changes is here in letter D. The project must follow professionally accepted restoration approaches. It used to be that projects were required to adhere to the Oregon Aquatic Habitat Enhancement Guide, but we changed that language to professionally accepted restoration approaches with the hope that it would foster more innovative projects. So what can't you do with OWEB restoration funds? Well, there's a number of ineligible project types in our rule, which I have here for you on the screen. You can't construct water storage that isn't related to restoration or protection. If your fish screening project is something that ODFW will pay for, then we can't pay for it through OWEB. We don't fund things that are compliance related. Routine project maintenance is also off the table. And if you have a water conservation project without a measurable benefit, as listed here, it's also something that would not be eligible for our program. Now, once your project makes it through that set of eligibility rules, then this is our famous, we call it the bubble diagram. Maybe famous is a little bit heavy of a word, but it's famous to us and our reviewers. What they do is look at this diagram, which summarizes our evaluation criteria, and they try to find projects that fit that sweet spot, that likelihood for success, which is in the center, meaning the project meets all 5 of those criteria. And as I mentioned, we're all going to delve into one criteria in particular. I'm going to start by talking about proposal clarity. So proposal clarity is really about a combination of the methods proposed in your application and then also how good the proposal is at conveying the information and available in the project. In our rule, this is what we're dealing with at the review team level. It has to be implemented using a clearly defined method. The objectives are clear and it's going to be able to meet those, and also is the project ready? And so again, proposal clarity, you really need to not only meet these rules, but have a pretty well-written proposal that doesn't leave any doubt in the reviewer's mind. So again, taking you back to our bubble diagram here, these are the 3 main things reviewers are thinking about when working with proposal clarity. So the clearly defined and appropriate methods. This is where they're just looking at your application quality and seeing how clear you've presented the information. They also want to know, is the method you selected appropriate? With project ready to implement, this is where you must make it clear within the application that the project is ready to move forward. I think that all of us understand that things come up in this field, and it's really challenging sometimes to meet a timeline or plan accordingly. Things come up, you have a permitting issue, a contracting issue, it starts raining early and your in-water work window is kaput. We all understand that things like that happen, but the reviewers still want to be pretty sure that the project is going to move forward as intended, because projects that are more ready will generally rise higher when it comes to prioritization. And so your proposal needs to instill confidence on the review team that the project is going to go ahead and happen. One of the key ways to do this is with your letters of support and your permitting approach. Make sure you provide information about where you are in the permitting process. In your letters of support, make sure that the partners writing the letters understand what the project is. If you're resubmitting, have them write a new letter. Don't have them just regurgitate the letter that they already wrote back in October 2015, because then the reviewers will wonder if they're still at the table. So you really want to make sure that everybody is on the board with what's going to happen with the project, and that the ducks are in a row for your project to move forward on the timeline that you've indicated. Lastly, you got to clearly state the objectives and describe how they will be met. And I'm going to delve into the goals and objectives a little bit further, because this is a real important point in any OWEB application. Goals and objectives. So goals and objectives and the difference between the two often seem to be a point of puzzlement for many of not only staff, but also the grantees. Sometimes everybody needs a refresher, right, about what is a goal and an objective. So a goal is a description of your destination, where you want to go, and an objective is a measure of the progress you need to get there. Goals are broad, general guidelines. They explain what you want to achieve. Objectives are the implementation steps to get to your goal. They should be specific and measurable. And the supporting details in your application need to constantly reflect your goals and objectives. And so here I'm showing you a lovely little creek. This is Long Prairie Creek from my neck of the woods. It's clearly got a problem. If you look at this creek, you guys might notice it's pretty choked with canary grass. Looks like it could use some large wood. There's clearly a need for something to happen here. And somebody's planning something. This is the goal of the project. They would like to work with the timber company to hire a contractor to construct 45 structures. And here's the objectives here. They want to increase your in-stream habitat complexity, reconnect the stream floodplain, yada, yada, yada. They've got a lot of goals and objectives. It seems well-meaning, but if you're a reviewer, you're looking at this and you're thinking, and now it's time for our first poll, where I want you guys to tell me what you think is wrong with these goals and objectives. Sean, can you pull up our first poll question? There we go. So if you're on the review team, can you tell what's happening with this project from these goals and objectives? And I also want to note that this is these have been loosely modified from an actual application, who the applicant will remain unnamed.
So it looks like about 2/3 of the folks on the call have voted. Let's just wait another second, see if folks want to read through them.
All right, why don't we move on, Sean? It's okay. So if you guessed both of the last two answers, you were correct. Although if you guessed they should have started treating the reed canary grass last year, that probably would also have been appropriate. So these goals and objectives aren't going to work. The reviewers can't tell what's going on. There's no broad primary outcome when the goals are being too specific. The objectives are not specific and measurable. Let's try this again. So here we have a better goal. They want to restore watershed function. They're thinking lofty. They're thinking broad. They're really flying at 35,000 feet here. And their objective, oh wow. If you're a reviewer, now you know what's happening, right? You know what they're doing, you know the reach of the project, how many trees are in the structure, what's the diameter, all your questions are answered. And with the way that our applications are currently structured, this is the place where reviewers are looking for information. And if you want to achieve some positive comments with regards to proposal clarity, the goals and objectives are where it's at. I wanted to mention one more thing before I turn it over to the next criteria. Proposal clarity, making a good map. Your map is another place where reviewers will look. And we want to make sure that you've got all the necessary features. We have information about this in our guidance and on our website. This is a really good map, obviously not from my wet and lush part of Oregon. This is from a project out on the east side. But one thing that's neat about this map, they've got a great legend, scale. There is a north arrow in the upper right-hand corner. They've clearly defined the phases and the activities. They've got a local jurisdiction nearby and roads to help reviewers orient themselves. So make sure you pay extra attention to your good map. You don't need a lot of fancy GIS skills to make a good map. We have resources available to help you, and we're producing a series of training videos on how to use Oregon Explorer for your mapping needs. So look for those soon on our website. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sue Greer, and thank you, and we'll check in later if you have any questions.
Hi, my name is Sue Greer, and I'm the OWEB Regional Program Rep for the Mid-Columbia region. I'm most familiar on the east side of the state. Not many people or much rain, lots of acres and a whole lot more blue sky. But that being said, I hope the following presentation will resonate to restoration being done all across the state. Next slide, please. Today I'm discussing the criteria of technical soundness used when reviewing restoration applications as defined by rule. Next slide. Technical soundness criteria gauges how the application explains how the project treats causes rather than symptoms, identifies and evaluates possible alternatives, and adequately quantifies watershed benefits. Let's look how this translates to real projects on the ground. Next slide. The first criteria for technical soundness is the proposal addresses limiting factors or watershed health problems by treating causes rather than the symptoms. First off, what exactly is a limiting factor? One restoration definition I found explained it as a physical, biological, and ecological condition that limits the ability of the ecosystem to sustain native plant and animal populations, limits the landscape from being able to withstand natural disturbances and maintain resiliency, and 3, limits the quality or availability of habitat that supports all life stages of native species. In some cases, limiting factors and associated causes can be fairly obvious, like this 5-foot-high perch culvert that's blocking steelhead from getting to quality upstream habitat. Easy to see the limiting factor: fish are not able to get past the culvert. But what are the causes? During the review process, discussions around the topic of causes could include: will replacing a culvert be sustainable and result in long-term expected benefits? Did past management impact the site? If so, how will changes in future management help sustain the goal of proposed restoration? Or do symptoms such as erosion and scouring extend outside the project footprint? Let's take a closer look and question some potentially even deeper causes. How did the culvert become perched? Was the culvert originally installed that way, or was it installed quite steep, creating extreme velocities that caused the scour at the outlet? Is that scour a result of flashy flows, highly erodible soils, and an insufficient base? What's the hydrology of the watershed? Are high flows in this basin linked only to melting snowpack or from thunderstorms in the summer? Was the culvert appropriately sized to handle both high flows and debris coming downstream, or could the scour be a result of debris blocking the culvert opening? What does the stream channel look like both up and downstream of the culvert? Is the channel straight, steep, in size down to bedrock? Is the existing culvert in alignment with the natural stream channel? Is there existing riparian vegetation to help stabilize banks? Next. Are there opportunities to integrate other restoration actions on the project to multiply the benefits and help address the causes? Elements such as fencing to protect riparian vegetation, riparian planting to increase species diversity, increase shade, and reduce erosion, and in-stream wood or boulders to add complexity and stability to the channel. If causes are not considered when designing a project, reviewers may question whether the proposed solution will end up in the same condition as the existing situation. The second criteria is the proposal identifies and evaluates alternatives to address the problem. The grant application process is highly competitive, but you know that, right? Sometimes an application discusses how the design will address the cause, but is missing information that explains how that particular solution was selected and what alternatives were even considered. A first step in fulfilling this criteria would include comprehensive analysis of the watershed and of the issue. This could include survey detail, modeling, hydrology, soils, flow, and/or precip, information that will provide a good background for the alternative discussion and help inform why the chosen solution was selected. For example, this photo shows a site where the landowner had an issue with the river eroding into his field. His solution was to armor the bank with boulders. When the review team looked at the application, it didn't include any detail on the solution other than the boulder riprap. But for this site, alternatives could have included bioengineering and sloping of the banks, fencing, riparian buffers, and planting, adding in-stream wood and boulders for complexity to help disperse stream energy, reconnecting the floodplain so high flows can drop out sediment and provide late season inputs of cooler, stored groundwater. Going forward with rocking the banks could resolve the erosion issue. However, the application would have been stronger if it had clearly explained what other options had been explored and why the riprap solution was determined to be the only viable solution compared to the alternatives. Being a past grantee myself, I realize it takes time to have these discussions with landowners, and sometimes alternatives are just not feasible. Floodplains may have existing buildings, high flows could take out fences built along the river, or by placing large wood in stream, culverts or urban infrastructure downstream could be at risk. The thing is, unless you'd include these discussions in the application, the review team won't know if they were even considered. And even more so, if you don't include these alternative ideas when you're discussing projects with landowners, you may be missing opportunities to increase the project's ecological benefits and thus resulting in a more competitive application. The third criteria is the proposal quantifies watershed benefits resulting from proposed restoration. The essential first step in any quantification process is to gain an understanding of the problem, determine the project objectives and resulting ecological benefits, then make a determination on what outcomes will result and how they will be measured. Be careful not to overstate the benefits. Have a plan on how you will validate them at project completion or at the post-project monitoring stages. Quantifying benefits can either be the easiest or the most difficult part of writing an application, depending on the project scope. For instance, it's pretty easy if you're removing or correcting a fish passage barrier to measure the miles of upstream habitat that will be made accessible. ODF&W is a great source for this type of information. If you plant and protect a stream with fencing, it's a little more complex, but you could estimate the amount of sediment reduced from entering the stream. By installing a pipeline to increase irrigation efficiency, you could show benefits by either leasing the water savings in stream or protecting them with the state's conserved water program. Or, if you have baseline data showing negative impacts of irrigation tailwater or ditch failure, you could quantify improved water quality by measuring the change in sediment entering the stream. And finally, by removing invasive juniper in the right places, vegetation transects can show increases in healthy native grasses and shrubs. There are tools available and partners with the expertise to help applicants define their project objectives and determine what quantifiable benefits will result. If you have questions and as you're developing an application, call your OWEB project manager or involve technical experts as partners on your project. Although not defined by rule, another element of determining technical soundness is providing designs with the application. Designs will influence technical review as different sections of the application are scrutinized, including the budget, ecological benefits, applicability to the site, permitting considerations, and determining whether the project is shovel-ready. Now we're going to have the poll. So looking at these project types, which ones would benefit from having engineered designs?
Looks like about 2/3 of folks, Sue, so far.
Give it a little more time, and then we can see what they say.
Looks like about 90% of the folks have now voted. So shall I close it?
Well, let's go forward then. Okay. So from my experience, I would suggest that 1 and 3 definitely would benefit from engineered designs. That being said, a schematic of riparian planting footprint showing species, planting densities, and location of any riparian fencing would be helpful to the review. Same with moving the CAFO. A good map showing the new location with distances to live water or other components would help mitigate identified limiting factors. The complexity of the project will determine the level of engineering required. Sometimes on simpler projects such as spring developments, conceptual designs with detailed site characterization can provide enough information to the review team for a comprehensive review. When developing complex projects, you should first consider submitting a technical assistance application to cost share on the analysis of alternatives, funding site surveys, developing designs, preparing permits, and any other elements that will improve your future restoration application. That's all I have for technical soundness. Now let's move on to the next review criteria.
You want to just pause for any questions at this point? You can either type a question in the question box or raise your little icon hand if you have a question. I'll call on you and unmute you. Okay, there is one question. All right. Just a moment. Okay, engineered is different than the schematic. I can't see a situation where you'd need an engineer to design a RIP planting plan, or riparian planting plan.
And I probably wasn't clear. I would say number 1 and number 3 of the poll, the replacing a culvert, and the number 3 was, removing a dike or a berm. Those, and I apologize for not being more clear. Number 1 and number 3, replacing a culvert or removing a dike or berm, those would most highly benefit from having an engineered design. That being said, I guess the point I was trying to get to is these other items, the planting or the CAFO, those you can kind of help the review team understand the complexity of the issue without having an engineering design, but that doesn't mean that you just say, no explanation of how you're getting there. Basis the schematic, basis, more detailed information that helps understand how you're going to resolve it. Does that answer your question?
He's still muted, but Clint, if you want me to unmute you and let you answer that, I will. Did that answer it, Clint? You can speak. Oh, I guess we can't hear him. Oh, yeah, no mic, but yes. Okay, sounds good. Go ahead, Sue.
It just moves on to the next one.
Good morning. I'm Karen Leindecker. I'm with Region 5 over in Eastern Oregon. I'm going to talk about perspectives on cost effectiveness. Cost effectiveness provides an overall budget that reflects expected and proposed watershed health benefits, and it reflects reasonable rates for both direct costs and match, with reasonable being the key word. So, review teams have gained a lot of experience over the years reviewing various types of projects. Go ahead and change the slide. And each of these kinds of projects have different unit costs. And some examples are juniper removal and non-commercial conifer thinning. They're basically the kind of the same thing. Costs include cutting on a per acre basis with graduated rates of light, medium, or heavy. And they generally correlate with a stage 1, a stage 2, or a stage 3 juniper, or likewise a light, heavy, or medium rate on non-commercial conifer cutting. Slash abatement's also on a per acre basis. You need to remember that slash abatement has different costs, and that would be whether a site is lopped and scattered, whether it's hand piled or machine piled. Those costs are also on a per acre basis. Again, they have a heavy, medium, or light rating, and those costs are all different. Note acres for cutting and slash abatement need to be the same. Otherwise, you are not accurately accounting for slash abatement costs. For example, if you're proposing to hand cut like 200 acres, you need to have the corresponding slash abatement acres as 200 acres. And make sure you put that same 200 acres for both slash abatement and hand cutting into the objectives section of the application. And from a watershed benefit perspective, conifer removal projects will rate higher depending upon the type of habitat that are going to be enhanced. So invasive species control or weed abatement projects, the direct costs for these kinds of projects include herbicides, surfactant, application methods. Are you putting it on aerially with a plane, ground base, with an ATV? Are you going to use a backpack sprayer? How many application rates and numbers are there going to be? All these costs are on a per acre basis, and they vary by the different methods. Costs vary depending upon location and accessibility. Watershed health benefits vary by type of habitat proposed for treatment. And weed projects that demonstrate high leverage and partnership, for example, with the BLM, with the Forest Service, with coordinated weed management areas, CWMAs, generally receive a more favorable review. Water quality improvement projects, these are typically flood to sprinkler irrigation conversion projects to eliminate runoff, and they also include piping earth and laterals. Those projects are much more common over here on the east side. Costs for these kinds of projects include the pipe cost, and that depends on the diameter of the pipe and what kind of pipe and what the poundage rating is on the pipe, what's the PSI rating. Installation is on a cost per foot basis, and that depends on the type of equipment you need. Electrical expense, material costs such as bubblers, fittings, couplings. Watershed health benefits for water quality improvement projects rank higher. For example, if that project is adjacent to a river, to a stream, or a ditch that transports sediment and pollutants further down the waterway, or if you have very steep slopes and have accelerated erosion rates. So next slide. Complex fish passage and river restoration projects generally need a completed or at least an 85% design. Perhaps you've gotten a TA grant to provide realistic and reasonable project costs. Costs determined from designs need to be incorporated into the budget, but not as a lump sum from the engineer's estimate. Watershed health benefits rate higher depending upon the type and the amount of habitat that's created, perhaps the distance of fish passage open, if a project addresses ESA-listed aquatic species and perhaps how many, and there's many other reasons. On this particular slide, both the bridge and the in-stream work had previous technical design before receiving a due fund recommendation for the restoration project. Then the diversion that's on the top left would need an engineered design to provide costs for future implementation. That design also needs to consider the cost and the design for a fish screen, and also needs a reasonable budget. So the next slide. So what do review teams look for when they're reviewing a budget? This particular project budget is from one project from the fall of 2017, and it was not recommended for funding. The budget and other aspects of the application lack clarity. This project is an example of a conveyance piping project that will pipe spur ditches to supply irrigation water for hundreds of acres. The review teams looked at least 130 miles of conveyance piping that's been installed in parts of Region 5, so they're very familiar and have considerable experience looking at these kind of projects. And on this particular project, mobilization was very high. This project is close to town, and the necessary equipment should be readily available. Over $75,000 for mobilization is very excessive, even if it's in kind. And remember, review teams are going to look at in-kind costs as well as what you're asking from OWEB. So all your costs need to be reasonable, not just what OWEB's providing. The project already included construction oversight for over $75,000, and if you look on the budget, it happened to be the exact same amount as mobilization. So this was clearly some kind of percentage from the engineer's design. They also requested another $23,000 from OWEB for project management, even though NRCS was doing the project management anyway. The number of hours requested was very high and seemed excessive, and the overall budget was excessive. Pipe installation costs were excessive. Prior OWEB-funded pipe installation costs were $12 to $15 a foot for similar sized pipe. This application wanted $30. This project had a breakdown in communication between the applicant and the local partners and resulted in the budget lacking reasonable costs and application clarity. However, from a water quality improvement perspective, there's a very high benefit from future implementation. And one note, this project was resubmitted in the spring of 2018, had a greatly improved budget and proposal clarity, and it was our #1 project just last week. So you can make your project better. Excuse me. Also, review teams recognize there's justification for higher than typical project costs. Just provide reasonable explanation and justification. Some examples would be perhaps access and transportation might be challenging. You might be a long distance away from the main road system or town. Maybe you have to walk the excavator or the backhoe up an unimproved road for a very long distance. Specialized equipment is required. Maybe that's not available locally or within a reasonable distance. There's many other possibilities why you need justification, but just be sure to put that in your application. So the next slide. This project had 2 prior technical assistance grants provided from OWEB that totaled over $80,000. However, when the restoration project was submitted, the budget lacked essential detail. Lump sums and budgets can result in no fund recommendations, especially projects where technical assistance and design were previously provided. So this project had no units, no unit costs, mobilization, type of equipment required, or any description of the work proposed. And also having the project cost at $763,104 seemed like false precision. While this project has potential to enhance habitat for ESA species, the application was premature and a detailed budget is needed for future positive review. I think there's one more click there.
Let me know when you want the poll, Karen.
I think now.
Oh, all right. I'll launch it.
So you're the reviewer. What do you think this application plans to do with $763,104? It should be a pretty simple answer. Do you have it?
Yep, most people have voted now. Let me close the poll and I'll show you the results. This is what folks are saying.
There you go. It's impossible to tell. So moving on to the last slide. What should you provide for an essential budget detail? This project provided an organized and detailed budget. Unit costs were appropriate and reasonable, and costs for many of the components were from an engineered design. Match was detailed. Partnerships were clearly demonstrated. There were 3 other partners in addition to OWEB. This project had U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Idaho Power, and the Ditch Company. So in conclusion, cost effectiveness, both from an economic and an environmental benefit perspective, is extremely important to receive a positive review. Please remember that unit costs must be reasonable. The number of requested units also needs to be reasonable, especially for your wages and salaries. Higher than typical costs need justification. And if an application is not recommended initially because of budget concerns, just submit an application with the requested clarity and provide that detail needed. And remember that even with a sound and a clear budget, if applications lack technical soundness, clarity, and the other necessary attributes for project readiness, they will not be recommended. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. You want to take any questions?
Sure.
Let's just see if there are any that come in. Okay, not seeing any, so we can just move on.
All right, good morning. My name is Mark Grenbemmer, and I'm the OWEB Regional Program Rep for Southwest Oregon, coming to you from Medford. This morning I'll be covering watershed context and its associated evaluation subcriteria. So in a nutshell, considering the key indicators of watershed context entails examination of several components to see how the project fits into and impacts the bigger picture. Addressing watershed context in the application requires providing information in almost every section of the application, which comes together to illustrate the entire picture of the project. Please note, not every subcriteria under watershed context has the same degree of opportunity in the application to help make the case for watershed context. So it's important to take advantage of the opportunities. The webinar is really not long enough to go into the actual specific locations in the application for each of the 5 subcriteria. So if you have questions we can't get to in the webinar, please don't hesitate to contact me, and we can follow up with a later time, and I can try to get some more detail. So these are the 5 criteria on the screen. I'm not gonna read them, but what you'll probably notice, they may not all seem to be what we would intuitively think of when we think of watershed context, but they are all part of the story and help put the project and its interrelated activities and conditions into perspective. Okay, with that in mind, what I'll do is kind of delve into each one of these little puzzle pieces a little more, and we'll talk about how you can help describe your project's watershed context. So the first one looks at the likely impacts to a site and the adjacent properties. Your project is going to have an effect. The scope of the project and a host of geographic and environmental factors help to dictate the change to the landscape. kind of think about the ripples in a pond analogy. Restoration efforts in one part of the watershed must consider the needs of the entire watershed. Changes in one area may cause undesirable effects both upstream and downstream, or they may have a really neutral effect or hopefully a beneficial result. Some questions reviewers will try to answer as they go through the application are, so what is the end result of the work and how will it affect the project site? How will it affect the project reach, the overall area the project's taking place in, neighboring properties? What's the scale of the project? Are there geologic, hydrologic, or other environmental considerations? Additionally, results from the project could either be intermediate or they could manifest themselves over time. So we kind of look at it, from different time perspectives. So design detail, defining the scope of the project, and discussion of project alternatives, as well as laying out site conditions and other design considerations are important for the applicant to describe. Go ahead and click to the next slide, Katie. Thanks. So the next criteria is addresses watershed function and ecosystem processes. This is one of the key criteria. Demonstrating the project will help improve, restore, or protect is vital. The primary goal of a watershed restoration effort is to restore the ability of the ecosystem to function. This can be a complicated aim because an ecosystem has a myriad of interactions. It's important that the restoration approaches look for those issues that affect the drivers of watershed function and processes and work to seek solutions to causes of those problems and not merely putting a Band-Aid over the symptoms. Of course, that can be easier said than done for sure. Understanding limiting factors, approaches to address them, and identifying locations that will have the biggest bang for the buck are all key ingredients that must be demonstrated in an application. Okay, next is specific action within a prioritized geography in a watershed restoration plan. Fairly straightforward. Tell us where you're working and the basis for deciding to work there. Is what you're proposing identified in an area that has been specifically called out in a legitimate restoration plan? Is that action deemed important? In other words, also, is that action identified in the plan? If so, name it. Reference the specific location that describes your project or project geography. If necessary to support your project's case, upload the relevant sections. For example, in the problem statement, it could be something to the effect, the 2017 Humble Pie Assessment and Action Plan identified lack of large wood in stream as a factor critically impacting coho production and juvenile overwintering survival between stream reach or stream mile 2 and 3 of Humble Pie Creek. We propose to add large wood in this section of stream to support coho production and overwintering survival. Okay, the next criteria fits within the context of past and future restoration. Basically, how does the project fit into the grand scheme for restoring or protecting the watershed? What work has gone before and what are future plans? Is there a prioritization or strategic action plan in place that guides these efforts? Are priority limiting factors being addressed first? Is this a phased approach? Are there lessons learned from earlier work, adaptive management, that are being incorporated into current efforts? Is there earlier projects that have been the result of that work, and how does that project build on those previous efforts? Please try to avoid projects that overall just seem to be kind of random acts of kindness and not part of a greater plan. Okay, the last criteria, public awareness that will lead to restoration opportunities. So not all projects will have an outreach component or lend themselves well to an outreach component. And that's okay. Sometimes location and land ownership can play a role in determining the outreach potential or value. A project does not need to have an outreach component to be eligible, so please don't try to force it if it's not feasible. However, if there is an outreach component, it can affect the prioritization of a recommended project. Types of outreach could be passive. The location of the project makes it highly visible and likely to lead to other landowners' interests, or more proactive, where the landowner might be acting as a goodwill ambassador for the project, or where there's specific media coverage, website coverage, newsletter coverage, or featured an annual or other reporting mechanism. So in wrap up, what does determining watershed counts or context entail? Watershed context covers a gamut of indicators and considerations ranging from how the project site and reach will be affected, how the work fits into strategic planning and prioritization efforts, its impact on watershed function and limiting factors, including water quality and life stages, how it builds on past or future restoration efforts, and its likelihood to be a tool for bringing on board future restoration efforts. Hopefully, as this webinar will illustrate, watershed context is just but one of 5 evaluation criteria that the review team uses, and only an application that meets all 5 evaluation criteria will be recommended for funding. With that, thank you, and I'd be happy to take questions or move on to the next presenter.
Okay, we'll wait just a second, see if there are any questions that pop in. Don't see any right now. Okay, I don't see any coming in yet. I do have a question for Karen, actually, that came in just as I was cutting it off. But I'll hold that question to the end, and we can open it up for general questions. Anybody have a question for Mark? Okay, I think we're ready for Greg.
Great. Good morning, everybody. My name is Greg Cianella, and I'm the Regional Program Rep in Central Oregon. I'm based here in Bend, and I'm going to talk to you about capacity of applicant, and this is really the human side of the review. So our first slide here is of the rules for capacity, and these are the actual rules listed in statute. And as Katie mentioned, these were recently revised, really with the hopes of presenting a clean and straightforward way of presenting the language and really getting at the particulars of what we evaluate as part of capacity of applicant. And so what we did is we took these rules and we created themes as visuals in a bubble diagram that you're all been familiar with through previous review criteria already discussed. So here is the zoomed in version of the bubble diagram for capacity of applicant. And so here we are teasing out a few themes of the rules, those themes being capacity, partnerships, securing long-term project sustainability, and applicants' track record and experience. Now I'm going to take a deeper dive into each themes a bit more closely. So the first one is organizational capacity, and actually, before I move further, I have our poll question here. If we could bring that up, Sean. Thanks. Mm-hmm. So when thinking about organizational capacity, what are important attributes to document regarding your organization's capacity?
Okay, it looks like most people have voted now.
Okay.
Ready to close it?
Let's do it. Wonderful. Yes. The answer is all the above. It's important that we see these attributes come across in the application. It really tells us a lot about your organization, its staff and board, and its broader constituents and partners in watershed restoration within your community. Building capacity, particularly with small staffs and small communities, can be challenging. It forces folks to wear multiple hats and juggle a lot at one time, and we certainly recognize that can be a challenge. And that is really where partners and community constituents can play such a huge role, and they can fill gaps, be it technical, managerial, fiscal, to help build that capacity and broaden the capabilities of your organization. So let's take a deeper dive into partnerships. Some of the key questions being asked by reviewers are here on the screen. So obviously this goes without saying, partners are an absolute necessity in the business of watershed restoration. Not only do we require a 25% match, we simply just could not do this work alone. As watershed problems and their solutions become more complex, having interdisciplinary knowledge in your project team has become more prominent and necessary to set yourself up for success. When it comes to partnerships and documenting this in your application, we really need to understand what that means to you in your project. So key aspects such as who and what is the partner bringing to the table are absolutely essential, such as if it's a technical partner, what role are they playing and what makes them qualified to do so. A really easy example would be an ODF&W local biologist reviewing fish passage criteria for a culvert replacement project. If it's a funding partner, what is the amount? Is it secured or pending? If it's a partner actively doing work on the ground, what exact part are they providing and for how long and at what cost? Or is it in kind? I can't stress enough about articulating in detail the who the partners are and what role the partners are playing. And letters of support are incredible, relatively easy ways to help document these relationships. There really is no rule on how these are to be written. I would suggest that the more genuine and detailed, the better. What's important to reflect is why they support and how they support. If there is a financial contribution, having that commitment in the letter certainly is very helpful. If the partner is providing stewardship or maintenance, at what duration and for how long. So thinking about that stewardship and maintenance, let's take a look at the next theme, and that is capacity for stewardship and maintenance and long-term sustainability. So some of the key questions that our reviewers are asking that are there on your screen, I think this goes without saying that it's inherent in all of us who do this, that we want to be successful and that we care. Success being the foundation of why we're in this business in the first place. Achieving success may have different meanings depending upon the goals, objectives, and outcomes for each project. Going back to Katie's discussion on proposal clarity, having very clear and succinct goals, objectives, and outcomes should help lay the framework for articulating clear guidelines for how you intend to sustain and maintain the project over time. So keeping that in mind, it is essential that we see and understand the course of actions you will take to ensure the investment is sustained and maintained for the ecological outcome described over time. In addition, help us understand whom and how often will these actions take place in order to achieve the desired state initially set out. This may vary depending on project type and property ownership. For example, a revegetation site likely requires more maintenance and longer-term stewardship, even perhaps indefinitely, in order for success to be achieved, whereas a culvert replacement may require less maintenance and stewardship over time, but yet still does require some level of effort post-project to understand its effectiveness. So I guess the key point really is to articulate how you have planned for this and how you intend to carry it forward. And this is really where your partners and landowners can be an incredible asset. Perhaps they agree to take on some or all the responsibility, and if so, how will they do this? How many site visits, how many times per year will your partner landowners do this type of maintenance? Maintenance such as, cutting juniper seedlings, going out and spraying weeds, or evaluating the success of plantings. Pinning down this level of commitment early on in the process will create less surprises in the future and also states that the project is ready to go. These can be captured also in letters of support. Reviewers really want to see that the thought, the depth, and the planning is in place at the onset of the project to achieve success. Now let's take a look at the last theme, and that is applicant's track record and experience. Again, on the screen, you're going to see some key questions that the reviewers are asking. Specifically, what is your grant history with OWEB? Have you implemented similar type projects in the past, and were they successful? Some key questions to think about when trying to articulate this in your application. Did the applicant seek and contract the appropriate assistance? Was it managed in a reasonable time frame, on or close to budget? Was the project installed correctly? The OWEB online database, Augmus, is a great tool for staff to help us understand what that track record looks like. So when it comes to experience, do you and or your partners' projects teams have the experience necessary to carry out the work being proposed? Are the appropriate level of skill sets and resources committed to this project that will dictate success? What we really want to understand is that the key players and partners involved in the project have what it takes to be successful. Describing the skill sets that people bring and specific experiences of the project team in the application is incredibly helpful. It's important that we see the documentation that the applicant project team have what it takes and the track record to back it up. Discussing past similar type projects and similar geographies certainly goes a long way as well. And one also thing I'll mention is that when setting up site visits with your local OWEB project manager, if there is a similar project that was implemented in the past that's close to your proposed project that you're going to do a site visit on, it might be good to go take a look at that with some of the reviewers. I know I've done that, and it's been really helpful to kind of look at past projects while you're out going to look at a proposed project. So to kind of wrap it up for capacity of applicant, having the right people with the right skill set assigned to appropriate tasks that is commensurate with their experience is absolutely essential. The best and most thought out design can go horribly wrong if the people tasked with the implementation and oversight do not have the appropriate experience, and vice versa. The design itself and the input data feeding that design needs to be done by people with the right skill set. Can't emphasize enough how important this piece is. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Liz, unless there are any questions.
Let's just pause a second and see if there are any questions that come in, Greg. Okay, I don't see any coming in, so I guess, Liz, you're going to finish this out.
Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. This is Liz Redon. I'm the Regional Program Representative for the Willamette Valley, and I'm based out of Salem. And what I'll be covering is that pathway from using these criteria that you've been hearing about to that list of projects that get recommended to the board twice a year. And think about it, so at this point in the process, the review teams discuss each project based on these review criteria. And I'm just going to take a moment to talk about the review teams. We have review teams in each of the regions. So each of us that have been speaking have a review team, and they're local people from those regions. And just like our applicants, our review teams have people that reflect the regions and the resources in those regions. These folks are from federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofits, tribes. And so we try to keep that cross-section of those kind of stakeholders, but also their expertise. We try to balance having the different kind of expertise needed to look at a variety of watershed restoration projects in that region. And so they come together and they have a discussion using these criteria. And through their collective knowledge and learning, they're identifying the strengths, concerns for each of the projects under these criteria to evaluate the projects. Then they vote on whether to recommend the project for funding. And at this point, what we, OWEB, are asking these folks is based on the information and the discussion of the strengths and concerns under each of these criteria, does the project have the ingredients to be likely to succeed that you would recommend it for funding, that you would recommend OWEB to fund this project because it will provide significant ecological benefits to watershed health. And then we end up with a set of projects in each of the regions that are recommended for funding, and they usually add up to more than what's available on the spending plan. And what you're looking at the slide is just to give you an idea of that situation. So right now, each grant cycle, we have about $8 million to spend statewide. In the last cycle that we just wrapped up, we had a little bit more asked across all the grant applications. So if you were to add up all those grant applications and what was being requested, and those that were also recommended, we had a little bit more money there. So we have to make a decision. And so I think this is a point to move into our next poll, Sean.
Mm-hmm.
So given this, what would you do to figure out how to identify which projects get funded? We can't afford them all, and we have to make a decision. So what would you do if you were in OWEB's shoes? So we're asking you to do that in the poll.
So this is an opinion question.
It's an opinion question.
Mm-hmm. Looks like about half the folks have voted. Okay, it looks like everybody who's weighed in everybody who's going to weigh in has. So let's see what the results are.
Survey says. Absolutely. We have to prioritize the projects. And so that's what we do. So go ahead and move to the next slide. And one more. And so we ask the review teams to rank. And so this is what the ranking information in our review criteria looks like. And according to administrative rules, the reviewers are asked to rank projects that are recommended for funding considering the following criteria. And I'm just going to hit the highlights. I'm not going to read through the whole slide. But these include things like how well the project meets those evaluation criteria that have already been discussed and are depicted on that bubble diagram that you've seen throughout the presentation. The certainty of success and likelihood the project will meet its ecological objectives. Benefit to the Oregon Plan, evidenced by its expected benefits to watershed functions, fish habitat, or water quality, and project costs relative to the anticipated watershed health benefit. Administrative rule also highlights that there should be a preference for projects that address altered watershed functions, address a human-caused alteration impacting water quality or habitat, addresses causes of disturbance over symptoms, and also include collaborative partnerships. And finally, a preference should go to projects that focus on upslope and upstream treatments or addresses a specific issue that encompasses the whole watershed conditions. And so we're asking reviewers to consider that collection of criteria. And then if you move to the next slide, you'll get a glimpse as to the form that they're looking at. We hand out, because this is an individual exercise, so remember when we are asking them to recommend a project for funding as a group vote, they have an individual exercise where they have to actually rank these projects, thinking about those criteria. When there's a project that they do not fund, they would obviously cross that one off the form and not rank it on this form. And then we collect all these forms and we put them into this magically a very complicated Excel sheet, which is the next slide. And that Excel sheet basically averages them out and gives us the final ranking form results. And so we get a list of ranked projects, and so move forward on the slide again, and we'll see a map. So we end up with a list of ranked projects in each of the regions, and then we have to make that funding line decision. And so just go ahead and move forward again. We have to draw a line. And so a lot of people ask the question, how do we decide to draw the line? There's a few things that we consider when doing that final line, and some of it is just looking across the different parts of the state and trying to balance out spending so that we have somewhat some parity across the state in what we're spending. But we also, as we're approaching that location, the project list where we're kind of running out of money, we start looking across the state at all the lists and going back to the original review criteria and thinking about how well those projects meet those criteria in both the original evaluation, the bubbles, and then also in that ranking set of criteria. And then we start drawing that line and we get that list that goes to the board. And just to wrap up, I just wanted to mention a few final notes about this process when we get to it, is that I think I used to be an applicant, and I think I thought reviewers were actually scoring every individual question and application, and that's not true. What they're doing is they're really having a broad discussion around those evaluation criteria and uncovering the strengths and concerns around the different bubbles. And so the idea is to have this understanding of the project, that you have enough information to make a recommendation. And so I would describe it more as looking at the projects and understanding the bundle of attributes and whether there's enough evidence there as to whether that project is likely to succeed in meeting the watershed health benefits. And so as you're doing an application, what I would recommend doing is taking that bubble diagram and looking at the different bubbles and the blocks and consider your project and the project story that you're trying to put together. And just ask yourself, as you're looking at the evaluation criteria, where are the gaps in the story? Where can you provide more information so that if you're in the review team's shoes, they would understand the full project story and find that evidence that the project is likely to succeed. The other final note that I just wanted to mention is that I wanted to be clear that what we've been talking about is the open solicitation process. So you noticed a pattern that we were opening up and showing the administrative rules and how we use them, and those are specific to open solicitation. All of our grant offerings have a set of rules associated with them, and so it's worthwhile, if you're looking at any of the grant offerings, just to crack open those administrative rules and take a look and ask those key questions of what is the information that the review team needs to understand my project and evaluate it effectively. And that is all that I had.
Great advice. Okay, there is one small question. I'm going to go ahead and ask it, and that will give time for other folks to pipe in with questions while I'm doing it. And Kelly, if I misinterpret this, I may, or maybe you can just type the right interpretation in, or I'll unmute you. You can raise your hand. This is a question back when Karen was talking about the budget, and I rushed through a little bit and didn't capture her question. But Karen, sort of a technical question, do we need to separate out the different CY, what's CY, Kelly, of rock sizes? I'm going to unmute you, Kelly. See if, are you there still, Kelly? Oh, cubic yards, of course. Cubic yards. Oh, she has no mic. So Karen, can you grab that question?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think the more detail that you have, the better. I mean, obviously, if you're using like 3" minus, 2" minus pit run, maybe you're doing a road thing. Maybe you're putting boulders in the stream and you need to know like that they need to be 3 feet in diameter. Those costs are going to be different there depending upon the type and size of rock. So I think it's more information that you provide in your budget is going to be better. But what you don't want to do is, we've had people who, for example, in fencing projects, rather than putting it on a per foot basis, you know, you need to describe, like for fencing, you know, how many strands of wire and whatnot. But sometimes people would go to the extreme and they'd put in like, we're going to have this many staples and we're going to have this many nails. You don't want to be super prescriptive, you know, you don't need that type of detail, but I would definitely recommend that you have the different size of rock involved, and also on the cubic yards if it's delivered, or if you have to get it from another site and provide transportation. Does that make sense?
Kelly says, just a moment. She says the unit costs are different, so probably good clarifier. And then said higher level detail is good, but don't go crazy perfect. So she's saying. So here's another question. I think we've answered that for Kelly, unless you say something else. We do have another question on another topic I'll get to. Okay, I'll assume that answered it, Kelly. Okay, I'm not sure who this question is to, but maybe you can tell by the question wording. Can you talk a little bit more about the cooperation between the ODA strategic implementation areas and bringing projects in those areas forward for OWEB grant funding? I'm not sure who would take that. But Marie, was that for anybody in particular, or you're just hoping somebody would address it?
This is Katie Duzick, and I'll take a stab at that. So, Maria, I'm assuming you're talking about the strategic implementation area grants once you've done your technical assistance grant and then are ready to move forward to a restoration grant. And so OWEB staff are pretty involved in the SIA process. Each of us RPRs with an SIA in our region participates within the SIA. We have attended the open houses. We've participated in the collaborative meetings. We have designated OWEB staff in Salem who are working with the ODA staff on the SIA program. And so for the initial flush of technical assistance grants that are going out to the SIAs this biennium, the OWEB staff in the field, us RPRs, are not completely connected with that process, but we are working with the both ODA staff and the OWEB staff in Salem to get a handle on the SIA program and what's coming in. And so there is a level of coordination. However, once the SIA projects are ready to go into our restoration or technical assistance open solicitation program, they will be treated like any other of our open solicitation projects. So while there is some coordination between ODA and OWEB ahead of time, they will go through the process as the other projects will. Although presumably you would include information in your technical soundness about the plans you're working with, and SIA would certainly be an appropriate plan to include also in watershed context. So I hope that answers your question. I should note that we have yet to see, at least in the North Coast region, an SIA project come through. They're still sort of in the infantile phase of working through that first technical assistance requirement. Perhaps one of my other counterparts have seen a project, and if you have, please do so. Please comment now and help Marie get the information she needs.
Great. I'll unmute you in case you have a microphone, Marie, or you can just type whether that answered your question or not. Oh, she says I don't, so okay. I want to ask a question, and I'm not sure who is the best one to answer it. Maybe you can, one of the six of you can address it, or more than one. I kind of want to just get real for a minute about what sort of trends you're seeing, or if you could say to yourself, man, I sure wish these applications would, so, stuff you're seeing, ways they've changed, the ways they've improved, or what, if you had one wish for improved applications, what would it be?
This is Greg over in the Central Oregon area, and one thing that I routinely see absent and I think would add a lot of value is underneath the budget, there is an optional section to justify the budget. And I think this goes a long way, whether or not your items in there need justification. It's always nice to articulate why those costs are the way they are presented in the budget. It just helps reviewers give a little bit of understanding of the background behind the details of the budget.
Ditto.
Great. Yes, some funders call that a budget narrative, and they require it. They require the detail in a narrative form. Any other advice around that question? If you could change one thing in what you see coming across your desk, what would it be?
This is Katie, and I don't know if I would change this per se, because I do have some folks that are doing this, but I really encouraged the applicants in the North Coast to come to me ahead of time before they're getting ready to apply, to talk about the project when it's in the development stage, to give me a chance to help them come up with a more competitive application. And I'm also willing to review applications ahead of time. And I would really like to increase the percentage rate of those applications that I'm able to have a cursory look at, because I do think it helps applicants better address the questions that I can see coming from the review team from my work with them. And so I totally get that it is super hard to have your application done ahead of time, or, and I get it. It's most people are scrambling at the last minute, juggling multiple projects in what are work windows. But if you can plan ahead and talk to your RPR before the application cycle comes around and give us that chance to work with you on some preparatory stuff, even better, having a look at the application before you submit it. That's really invaluable, and I'd love to see a majority of grantees in the North Coast doing that.
So this is Sue. I would echo what Katie just said, and especially on the east side of the state for the fall cycle, think about potentially doing site visits where I can arrange for my review team to get out on site even as you're conceptualizing the project or close to, you might not have the application done, but basis weather and accessibility. Many times with the November cycle, it's very difficult to really see a project when there's 2 feet of snow, if we're that lucky. But so think about that fall cycle. Try to get site visits done in advance. Bring review team members and myself in as you are conceptualizing. And again, don't wait to the last minute if you don't have to. Shoot it by your project manager in advance so they could red flag where things aren't clear.
And this is Liz. I want to echo both the budget question, answering that budget question. That is one of the things I hear reviewers often saying, that they wish more people would utilize the question that provides an opportunity for narrative around the budget more, and also contacting your RPR, or if it's another grant program, the project manager, like a FIP person. We're here to help. We love answering the questions. If for some reason there is not time, because as we've already mentioned, we all know sometimes it is a last minute thing, we don't have time to contact or get a review of the application. As I mentioned before, use the bubble diagram. It is available. We're happy to share it. It really is the conversation that review teams are having. And when I came over from an applicant to OWEB and got to see all the review team discussions, one of the things that struck me the most is how consistently review teams are discussing those applications around the evaluation criteria. And so that bubble diagram, I think in some ways is our Rosetta Stone, where we can all be speaking the same language, providing the information review teams need to look at these projects and understand them.
Great. As a follow-up question, written in, can you also talk about the trends of projects and where you're seeing greater need? You know, sort of, I wish we had funded more of this kind of project.
I'm happy to jump in, guys, unless there's someone else that wants to jump in first. All right, I'll take a stab. So I think one of the things that, this is a common question, or I get a lot of them along this theme, which is what are OWEB's priorities? And so I'm going to step back a moment and just talk a little bit about the difference of open solicitation versus others. So in open solicitation, OWEB isn't setting priorities. We're not saying we see a gap in this area, so we think more people should fund it. The FIP, the focus investment, that was about OWEB board setting priorities around certain habitat areas. Under open solicitation, the grant program is set up truly to ask the communities of Oregon, the applicants, the organizations, to take a look at their watersheds, gather data, understand the information there about those habitats, and come up with a strategy that you think is important to that watershed health. And then in the application, the questions are intended to provide space to explain that logic pathway from what does your watershed look like, what are the concerns, the limiting factors you've identified, what are the strategies you're choosing to address those limiting factors, and provide evidence as to why they're priorities. Applicants are really good at connecting them to things like the TMDL plans, recovery plans. Provide us those information, that background, and then show us the pathway to the solution. And then the review teams help us check those things. That they're there to give us that technical advice as to, yep, that's a strength of the project, that's a concern, and then what's likely to succeed. So I want to emphasize OWEB under open solicitation doesn't set the priorities. It really is a community-driven process, and then you explain to us how you got there. Other RPRs, welcome to add to that.
Great clarification, Liz. Thank you. So it is 11:30. I want to just take a moment to say a huge thank you to your team to pull this together. It'll be great to have this recorded and available for anybody to view. You know, it makes us feel more like we're all a team working for the same thing, and it's a good reminder to have conversations with you early in our thinking, that we don't have to have it all figured out before we come to the proposal stage. So really want to thank you. So just a reminder that this will be posted on the Network of Oregon Watershed Council's website. We'll have the PowerPoint posted and that bubble diagram. I think, Katie, you said that you'd make that available, as well as a link to the recording.
We sure can.
Great. And one final reminder is that as soon as we get off here, you'll get a request to complete a couple of survey questions, and would really appreciate everybody taking the moment to just answer those couple questions. So thank you again all for participating, and for the RPR for taking this time to do it. Really great information.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and everybody for participating.
Yep. Thank you again.